Next, from Springfield and the annual conference of the State University Annuitants Association, we hear a lecture on why Illinois state government continues to struggle financially. Ralph Martire, the executive director of the Center for Budget and Tax Accountability, says state government doesn't have a spending problem, but a tax problem. He shows how Illinois' current tax system fails to tax as much as 2/3 of Illinois' economic activity. This runs about 45 minutes.
Well, good afternoon. How are you? I'm good. In fact, I'm thrilled to be here. You have to think about my job. A lot of it involves walking around the state and explaining to people why taxes are actually good. And so, frankly, I'm pretty happy to be invited, well, anywhere. So, getting invited here is a real pleasure. Now, we're going to talk about the state budget today and what's happening long-term, short-term, how it interplays with the economy. The long and short, I'm going to give a spoiler alert. Illinois' long-term problems have always been caused by really poor tax policy. That has driven our fiscal bus for over 5 decades now. And unless this state grows up and gets to the point where we could deal with tax policy, I really hope you enjoy hearing me talk about our fiscal woes, because they're just going to continue. And we will just continue to do bad things, whether it's from taking away pension benefits to health care benefits, to cutting current services for education, health, etc. So that's the spoiler alert. But I'm going to walk you through some of the numbers and facts that demonstrate the reality of that. So we now have a 2013 budget. Kind of. It passed. And lo and behold, after you look at the past due bills that we have to pay, the hard costs that we have to pay, there's only $15 billion available for current services in the year 2013. They appropriated $23 billion. That leaves a $7.6 billion deficit. So that's where we are right now today if everything goes incredibly well. That deficit number probably will increase by the end of 2013 by anywhere from $500 million to $1.5 billion. Okay, so, but the minimum deficit we have, our starting point, based on what they passed, is going to be about $7.7 billion. Now that's a real problem because of what we spend our money on. Question: has anyone heard a politician say, I'm going to solve our problem with across-the-board cuts? Can I see a show of hands? Yeah. Here's the board. Over 9 out of $10 gets spent on just 4 things: education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. This is historically. This is over the last 40 years in expenditures in Illinois, and this pretty much tracks what state governments spend their money on. And that's why it's easy for a politician to say across-the-board cuts, very difficult for a politician to say what will be cut. Because actually, if you look at what the state of Illinois spends on, it spends on the priorities I think we would all accept are those things that need invested in. Now, Quinn, when he was proposing his 2013 budget, told us he was going to have a rendezvous with fiscal reality this year, that we had to solve our fiscal problems, right? Mm-hmm. But his rendezvous stopped a little short of reality. It focused all on spending cuts. Nothing on the revenue side. Nothing on the tax side. And spending cuts really shouldn't be the primary focus of how we solve our fiscal problems anymore. Why not? Well, number one, overspending on services really didn't cause these deficit problems, and I'm going to give you the numbers on that in a second. And number two, you can't cut your way to prosperity in poor economic times. In fact, the more state government cuts spending on current services, the more it harms our current economy. And once again, I'll give you the numbers on that. So it's really poor economic policy. It turns out to be unjustified fiscal policy, and it doesn't even address the major cause of our deficit problem to begin with. Other than that, let's go ahead and cut. All right, now I promised to tell you or show you that in fact spending hasn't been driving our deficit problems. And this is the first part of my proof. This is comparing general fund spending on those 4 core services, education, healthcare, human services, public safety, from the year 2000 to 2013. And in nominal dollars, if you just compare the actual dollars spent without adjusting for anything like inflation or population changes, what you see is it looks like we're spending 16% more in 2013 than we did in 2000. But that's silly, right? I mean, you have to adjust for inflation and population changes. It costs more to provide the same level of services from year to year, just based on changes in the cost of goods and services. And in fact, it costs more to provide the same level of services to more people. So the first adjustment we made was for inflation using the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And lo and behold, the second you adjust for inflation, in 2013 we're actually spending in real terms 19% less on education, health, human services, and public safety than we did in the year 2000. So that's a pretty significant cut. Now the problem with that comparison is it is using the Consumer Price Index, which is a great inflation metric for the economy as a whole, but not so much for public spending. I mean, think about it. It includes things like the price of Clorox bleach, uranium, hair care products. State government doesn't buy a lot of Clorox bleach or uranium or, well, since Rod's been gone, hair care products. What state government buys is labor. You think about every public service area. They're labor intensive. And in fact, 85 to 90% of our budget expenditures are the wages of the teachers and the healthcare providers and the social service workers who are actually delivering these public services. So there is an inflation metric tied to the cost of buying labor. It's the Employment Cost Index. Using the Employment Cost Index, we're actually spending almost 25% less on core services today than in the year 2000. So there's been a significant scaling back in public expenditures on services. I just wanted you to know, I love charts like this, by the way, that have like millions of numbers, but I just wanted you to know at the end of the day, we are cutting virtually every public service we spend on. I broke it out by every major line in the state budget. And this is over the time period 2000 to 2013, adjusting for inflation. You can see that K through 12 education is cut by 12% this year compared to 2000. Higher ed, who needs that? 40%. Healthcare, 22%. Human services, 31%. Public safety, 24%. So it really doesn't even matter which public service you isolate. In real terms, we are very much scaling back our investment. So what the legislature decided to do this year on the revenue side was to cut revenue. And the way it decided to cut revenue was to give significant tax breaks to a couple of very large corporations, the Chicago Mercantile Exchange and Sears. So this year alone, the tax breaks for CME will add up to $51 million. By next year, when they fully phase in, 2014, there'll be $93 million, almost $100 million in tax breaks for one company. Sears got $15 million. Better yet, how about the estate tax cut? Now, it might be a sensitive issue, but I have to say, the estate tax is paid by less than 2% of the estates in Illinois. It's a tax paid by the wealthiest of the wealthy. And we cut that tax too. So their one focus on the revenue side in a revenue-starved state is to cut revenue significantly. Total impact, $242 million a year when fully phased in. Jobs created to spur the economy from these tax expenditures for business, affluent people, jobs created, zero. $242 million taken away from healthcare, taken away from education to create zero jobs. Now, why that should maybe be questionable public policy is if you look at the profit profile of the CME. According to their own reports, last year they made $950 million in net profit after paying all their expenses and this and that. $950 million in net profit. So we just took public taxpayer dollars and subsidized their profitability up to over the $1 billion a year level. That was our public policy there. Now, Sears promised us that in exchange for their $15 million a year tax break that they wouldn't close any facilities in Illinois. That was in December of 2011 when they were making the promise and getting the tax break. In January, after the tax break had passed, of 2012, a month later, they closed 5 facilities in Illinois. That was our good deal there. Now, just to compare that to what we're doing for a similar amount of revenue, to what we lost to CME and Sears, we closed 8 Department of Corrections facilities, 2 Department of Juvenile Justice facilities. We closed and reduced staff at offices in DCFS, Ag, Central Management, Illinois Police, etc. And that didn't quite come up to the total value in savings of the 2 tax breaks for Sears and CME. Total jobs cost through these cuts and consolidations, about 2,661. So our tax policy was to cut taxes for large, profitable businesses and to pay for those cuts by closing public sector facilities for an overall net job loss of 2,600 jobs. That was our public policy this last year. Now, hurting the private sector with spending cuts is actually what happens at the state level. So I'm going to ask that question a different way. So who has heard a politician say, I will not support a job-killing tax increase? Show hands? Okay. So as it turns out, if you look at something called data, tax increases and maintaining spending don't cost you jobs. In fact, they keep jobs. Cutting spending does cost you jobs. Why? Remember back when I showed you the spending charts, I said most of state government spending is on the wages of the workers delivering the services, right? Whether they're social workers or teachers or healthcare providers. What is our economy writ large? It's consumer spending. 68 to 70% of all economic activity is folks like you and me and teachers and firefighters going out and buying dry cleaning and lawn care, whatever. That's the economy. So when state government cuts spending, it's taking money directly out of the consumer economy because about 85% of all its expenditures are wages of people who no longer have income to spend. Now, there was a really good piece of work done on this by a guy named Mark Zandi. Do you all know who Zandi is? He's the chief economist at Moody's.com. And he's no liberal economist. He was the principal economic advisor to Senator John McCain, Republican Senator John McCain, when McCain ran for president. Okay? So he's a Republican conservative economist. Using his multipliers, for every dollar state government cuts in spending on, let's say, education or healthcare, the private sector economy, through the multiplier impact, loses $1.31 of economic activity. So I showed you that our deficit in Illinois right now is between $7 and $9 billion. It's right at $7.5 billion. If we were to cut $7 billion in spending, our private sector would lose 99,000 jobs based on the impact of people losing their wage and not buying in the economy as that multiplies through. Now, if instead you raise taxes the right way, and the right way is on affluent people, and I'm going to have a little bit on this later on. If you raise taxes the right way and maintain spending, you don't hurt your economy. In fact, you keep it. Why? Well, because affluent people don't spend most of their income because they have a lot of income and a lot of income growth. So you tax them some more and you don't change their consumption patterns. So they continue to consume, you don't really hurt your private sector economy, yet you have the revenue needed to pay for the salaries of low and middle income workers that are delivering services. So that's why all this popular rhetoric about job-killing tax increases really misses the boat economically. And in fact, none of the stuff that the supply side economists have contended would help create economic expansion in America has ever been borne out by the data. yet we still continue to buy it. So anyway, it would be really poor public policy for the state to continue on its path of cuts. As you could see, spending really didn't contribute to the deficit growth over time anyway. And right now, when we're emerging from a really difficult recession, cutting spending that takes money directly out of the consumer economy and then flattens out job growth or causes more job loss is a really bad idea. So then how did Illinois fare economically during the recovery period, the first full year of the recovery? Remember, the recession ended in June of 2009. Well, over 2010, look at the two worst states in economic growth in the Midwest, Illinois and Missouri. Guess which two states have the lowest taxes in the entire Midwest? Illinois and Missouri. The two lowest tax states performed the worst coming out of the recovery last year. Now, this is nothing new for Illinois, by the way. Our economic growth has lagged the Midwest and the nation since 1979, so we're used to being a laggard. But, you know, coming out of the recovery, we looked particularly bad. So where is Illinois? We're a big state overall. We have a $650 billion annual economy. So let's talk about tax increases, by the way, in context of that. My organization thinks that right now the state probably needs, over and above our current level of revenue, maybe about another $4.5 billion to make it go. We have a $650 billion economy. That's less than 1% of the economic activity in Illinois, if we were to tax that. That's what we need. Less than 1% of the economic activity in our state. You know how much that would hurt jobs if we were to tax that up? None! It's too small to measure. There's no econometric tool that could measure a tax increase of less than 4%. It's less than 1. This is what we can't do. Now, as it turns out, that $652 billion economy makes us the 5th richest state and the richest nation in the world. And if we were an independent country, it would give us the 27th largest economy in the entire world. So Illinois actually has a larger economy than Saudi Arabia and Ireland and Greece and Norway and some places you may have heard of. But as I told you, our economic growth has lagged the U.S. and the Midwest for a long time. This is from, well, this is even 1997 to 2010. Now you look at Illinois and you compare it to the Midwest, you go, well, Ralph, that's about a tie, 19% statistically to 21% really. I go, yeah, but the Midwest includes this state called Michigan. And Michigan hasn't had a good economy since Moses. So you take...
It's a long time.
Yeah, it's a long time. You take Michigan out of the Midwest, and the Midwestern economic growth over this period jumps about another 4.5, 5 points overall. So we were ahead of Michigan. We were about tied with Ohio, which has had a really hard time losing a bunch of jobs. And we were behind everybody else in the entire Midwest. So what have we been cutting on? Human services, healthcare, and education. These have been bearing the brunt of the cuts recently. And for the longest time, the first thing that we cut at state government has been human services. And this shows you that over the last 12 years, the cycle has been to cut human services expenditures every single year. Now, we just started cutting education significantly the last 2 or 3 years. K through 12 education. We've been cutting higher ed since the Blagojevich administration. Healthcare, we just started really cutting this year and the year before. So human services has been the favorite whipping boy for the budget acts for a long time. Why would that be? Okay, what do we spend our money on? Education, healthcare, human services, and public safety. That's 90% of the budget, right? We have a political process, believe it or not, governing our budget. We don't have enough resources to fund these core services. So now politicians have to decide how to divvy up the pie and which service item gets cut first. Education. Who here has a child? Anybody have a kid in the room? Okay, let me ask you, who here has ever been a child? Anybody ever been a kid in the room? So education has something close to universal voter understanding and support. It is politically popular. Everyone gets the value of a quality education. Probably not the very first thing they're cut. They're cutting it now because our fiscal condition is so bad. Not the first thing. Healthcare. Anybody here ever have to see a doctor? Ever? Yeah. Once again, universal understanding. Public safety. Like coming home to a safe street, no gangs, no violence. Of course. Human services. So, okay. What are human services? Well, over half, roughly 54% of all human services expenditures are two things: mental health and developmental disabilities. Okay, you get up to 3/4 of the human services budget when you include the Department on Aging, caring for homebound seniors, that sort of thing. And the final 25% of human services expenditures are things like caring for abused and neglected children, preventing, treating domestic violence, child care for single working parents, substance abuse, that kind of stuff. So, show of hands, who has a developmentally disabled adult living with them in their immediate family? Nowhere near universal voter understanding or support for the human services sector. So being fiscally bankrupt has caused Illinois, one of the richest places in the entire world, to make the morally bankrupt decision to consistently cut services needed by the most vulnerable populations because it causes the least political harm. That's the reality imposed on this state by having poor fiscal policy. Okay? I'm trying to connect some dots. And then there's Medicaid. So this year we're going to cut Medicaid expenditures by $2.1 billion. Here you can see a 3-year growth pattern for Medicaid. And the governor, if you remember, initially targeted Medicaid for $2.7 billion in cuts this year. Okay, I have a question for you. This is a great one. How much has Medicaid expenditures contributed to our deficit coming into this year? Anybody know? The answer is $0. Medicaid has contributed nothing. In fact, Medicaid has freed up some money to spend on other things. How do I know that? This includes all Medicaid expenditures, general fund, non-general fund, paid for by all sources in the state of Illinois. You can see in 2007 they were $12.5 billion. By 2011 it jumped to 16.2. That's a huge increase, right? We didn't pay for it. See this light blue bar? That's the amount of state tax dollars used to fund Medicaid. You notice state tax dollars declined. So by 2011, we were only using $3.3 billion to pay for Medicaid, whereas in 2007 we were using $4.2 in state tax dollars. The green bar is federal transfers under the Medicaid matching program. So basically we've gotten the federal government to pay for over 70% of the Medicaid services delivered in Illinois by ginning up the match system legally, I might add, through two things, that sort of navy blue dark bar in the middle. And the two things are InterGovernment Transfers and special assessment charges we make against the hospitals and nursing homes. So here's how that works. InterGovernment Transfers. We'll go to the Cook County government and say, give us a check for health care. And Cook County says, sure, how much do you want? Say, I don't know, $800 million. Cook County goes, no problem. Here you go, check. State of Illinois, $800 million. You say, thank you very much. The very next day, we give a check back to Cook County. Here you go, Cook County, $800 million. Go use this for your healthcare system. The second we ship that money right back to Cook County, it counts for federal match at 50%. We spent nothing in tax dollars and got $400 million from the feds. Okay? The hospital assessment and the nursing home assessment work the same way. So we collect a special assessment from hospitals and nursing homes. We say, thank you very much, hospitals and nursing homes. We pay it right back to them for their Medicaid populations, and when we pay it back to them, it counts for federal match. So up until this year, rather than costing the state money in real terms, Medicaid and the way we financed it freed up $900 million to spend on education and human services. Is that what you got out of the media reports? Now, would we have to start spending more on Medicaid into the future out of state revenue? Yes. Federal matching rates have decreased. We have maxed out what we could do on intergovernment transfers. So going forward, we would have to start putting a little bit more. But it's interesting, we wouldn't have to get back to fiscal year 2007 levels in state dollars for about 5 years. So the whole blame of Medicaid for our fiscal problems is absolute positive hooey. Now, one data point I do want you to know is that healthcare is increasingly something that if the public sector doesn't deal with it, people don't get to see doctors. 43% of the folks in Illinois who have a full-time job do not get offered health insurance as a benefit on the job. 43% of the people with a full-time job. In fact, a third of our state's population is either entirely uninsured or on Medicaid. A third, 32% and change. So unless the public sector has Medicaid available and other supports, increasingly working families cannot afford to get sick. And it's really annoying for us taxpayers, apparently, when poor people get sick. So now, I want you to look at our education expenditures. Proposed pre-K through 12 appropriations are 12.4% less in 2013 than they were in 2000. So that's a major cut in education. And that's probably not the best public policy, especially when you're in a state like Illinois that is already doing a horrible job funding public education. How do we know that? Who here has heard of EFAB, the Education Funding Advisory Board? Okay, EFAB is an independent group that does a really simple thing. They look at what it costs to educate a kid, basic education. In fact, their definition of a basic education is an education of sufficient quality so that 2/3 of the children in your school district who aren't at risk will actually pass the state's test. That's a pretty low standard, right? And then they come up with a dollar cost for that. And they tie it to the foundation level, which is our minimum expense on pre-K through 12 education in Illinois. In the year 2003, the state's actual foundation level was $120 less per child than this minimum established by EFAB. That's not very good. You're obviously providing a highly inadequate education to most kids. By 2012, it had grown to $2,200 less per kid. From the cost of getting 2/3 of our non-at-risk children passing tests. So it throws 1/3 of those kids out the window. And forget the at-risk kids, kids coming from poverty or with special needs. We're not even trying to educate them. So we're only trying to educate 2/3 of the children with a reasonable likelihood of educational success, and we're not even doing that. Now the cost of filling this hole would be $3.1 billion. New money right now to just get up to the EFAB standard. So I thought I'd like to take these cuts on education expenditures and put it in context of the economy and economic competitiveness. And so now is a really, really bad time to be disinvesting in education. I mean, the correlation between educational attainment and economic viability in a modern economy is closer today than it has ever been. In fact, you could no longer graduate high school and get a good job anymore. You've really got to go on and credential yourself at the higher levels. Unemployment rates have always been correlated with educational attainment. This is less than high school unemployment rates, shooting down to with a college degree. And you can see how there's a direct correlation. And that works across the board, except for art history majors, and really no one can help them. All right. But they make good coffee, so. The big change in correlation between educational attainment and economic viability is on wage. So now, you really need a college degree if you're going to earn enough money to feed a family. Every worker in Illinois since 1979 who has less than a college degree has seen their income decline in real terms since 1979. Only those with a college degree have seen a real increase in income, meaning a real increase in purchasing power, meaning an ability to maintain or enhance a standard of living. So the bottom line is if your K through 12 system doesn't provide you with the numeracy and literacy skills you're going to need to go on and credential yourself at the secondary education level, it's game over for you economically. You will not be a viable member of the modern economy. So another thing that we know about the Illinois economy is that wages for minorities continue to lag wages for whites. Now there's been a growth in the wage gap between whites and Latinos in Illinois. You can see this from 1980 to 2010 of 46%. That's pretty significant growth, and some of that frankly is discrimination against Latinos. Some of it is not. Some of it is neutral labor market forces. The Latino population has a significant number of immigrants who are willing to take low-paying jobs, right? And English as a second language issues, etc. Well, how about the growth in the wage gap between whites and blacks of 92% in Illinois? There's absolutely nothing neutral labor market force type to explain that. So number one, you see that racial discrimination still very much impacts labor markets in Illinois. Can't back away from it. But the way we fund schools also does. Because Illinois is the most reliant state in the nation on property taxes to fund educations. And as it turns out, African Americans are clustered in high poverty communities with very low property values. In fact, 92% of African Americans live in communities where the poverty level is 30% or higher. Poverty becomes a major obstacle to educating a child at 25%. So unless you make up for what your property values aren't going to put into education with adequate state funding, you've basically consigned African Americans to not be viable in a global economy because you're not giving them the skills they need to compete. And if you don't give them the skills they need to compete, they won't go on and credential themselves, and that'll show up in your wage data, and lo and behold, it has. So the causes of our problems in Illinois, as I told you before, were bad tax policy. And bad tax policy led to irresponsible fiscal practices. Read, borrow money from the contribution owed to the pension system to cover current service delivery, right? That's the irresponsible fiscal practice. And then we had the Great Recession. So for taxes to work in a modern economy, they have to be fair, responsive, stable, and efficient. We're 0 for 4. That creates this. This is the structural deficit. This is why we don't fund our pensions. This is why we don't fund our schools. This is why we cut health care. It's why we do all that bad stuff. The blue bar just shows you the cost of maintaining 2012 service levels and current law into the future, adjusting for inflation and population changes, assuming a normal economy. The red bar, same assumptions except our revenue system. The gap between the red bar, revenue growth, and the blue bar, service cost growth, is the structural deficit. We've had one of these for over 50 years. It's been tax policy for over 50 years that has caused our problems. You see this nice little slide down, that's the phase out of the temporary tax increase, which when it's fully phased out will cost us about $3.7 billion annually in lost revenue. So I'm looking forward to that, because we could really afford to give that revenue away. Now, Amanda is going to give you a phenomenal presentation on pensions, so I'm not going to talk much about that. But I will say the problem with the pension system is this. This is the pension ramp passed in 1994 to repay all the borrowings from the pension system. It's a debt repayment schedule is what it is. If you were structuring a debt repayment schedule to a bank for your mortgage, would you make it look like that? So that every year you had this monstrous increase you know you couldn't afford? No, you wouldn't, right? All our problems with this, and this is what's creating fiscal pressure. Nothing inherent in the pension system is creating our fiscal pressure. So all the attacks on benefits and stuff are off point. We got to fix our debt repayment schedule. And unless we fix that, I don't care how many benefits they take away from you, they're not going to be able to afford providing current services, and the fiscal pressure from the pension debt will continue. Is that clear enough? That needs fixed. Okay, we'll leave the rest to Amanda. So the options we have, we could borrow more money, we could defer making payments to providers, we can, let's see, I don't know, cut services, or we could actually, I don't know, fix the problem by raising tax revenue the right way. The two biggest things we need to do are go to a graduated income tax structure in Illinois and tax services. Taxing services. So net, of the 46 states that have a sales tax, we have the third most narrow base. The base of a tax is just what it applies to. Why? We don't tax services, we do tax goods. So our sales tax focuses on hard physical things you could touch, like my tie, that tablecloth, etc. Not services like haircuts or lawn care or bowling. Back in 1965, services were 36% of our economy and goods were 32%. Here's what we do tax. It is now 12% of our economy. That's what we don't tax, 60% of our economy. Any questions why that doesn't work? Because really you're going to the remedial budget class, if there are. Net, you can't leave the largest and fastest growing segment of your economy entirely out of your tax base and assume you're going to be able to balance your budget over time. And doesn't that kind of look like the growth in the structural deficit over time? Because it very much is a big contributing factor. It's we tax the wrong way. All of our neighboring states already tax services far more than we do. Kentucky, Missouri, Indiana tax somewhere between 25 and 50% of the services we think ought to be taxed. Iowa and Wisconsin already tax all of them. And I don't think, have you seen people from Iowa coming here to get their hair cut in busloads? No? Have you seen their haircuts? They should start coming. But they are not coming for tax reasons, and they've been taxing haircuts in Iowa for a long time. All right. So then I said a graduated income tax would also be a really good thing for the state to have. And here I hate to do this, I'm going to read directly here. This is a quote from a guy I love, Adam Smith. Subjects of every state ought to contribute toward the support of government as nearly as possible in proportion to their respective ability. That is, in proportion to the revenue which they respectively enjoy under the protection of the state. As Henry Homeload Kames has written, a goal of taxation should be to remedy inequality of riches as much as possible by relieving the poor and burdening the rich. That's the wealth of nations. That's not Marx. It's not the musings of Stalin. It's the guy that invented capitalism. Now, the reason he said this was the way to design a tax system to be fair and responsive to the economy is because he theorized, Adam Smith theorized, in a capitalist economy, economic growth would always disproportionately go to the top over the bottom and middle. So to be fair, you focus taxes where people have the fastest growing incomes, and to respond to the economy, you focus taxes up there. Was Adam right? Yes, he was. From 1947 to 1979, the top 10% in America got 34% of all income growth. 10% got 34%, leaving 65 for everybody else, for the bottom 90. From the advent of supply-side economics forward, it switched, where the top 10% now gets 63% of all income growth in America, leaving just 36% for the bottom 90%. So to be fair, you would focus your taxes on people at the top who'd be paying out of their growing wealth, rather than people at the bottom and middle who are now paying out of their growing poverty. Also, to respond to the economy, it's much like that sales tax chart. All the revenue income growth is here. Don't focus the taxes down here. Illinois, we're the flip of progressive and graduated in our tax structure. We are regressive. And in fact, folks at the bottom and middle have tax burdens in state and local taxes more than double those at the very top. So that doesn't work. The best way to fix that is with a graduated income tax. Now, unfortunately, the Illinois Constitution has a requirement that there be one flat tax that applies to all people. We looked at that and we said, well, in 2014, if we could get a graduated rate amendment passed, what could that look like for Illinois? And we modeled it out and you could cut taxes for everyone on average in Illinois earning $150,000 or less in taxable income. So this is after your deductions. This is taxable income. $150,000 less. That's 94% of the taxpayers in Illinois would get a tax cut. We'd raise $2.5 billion more in revenue than the current system. And the actual effective tax rate that millionaires would pay, the highest marginal rate would be 11% on very top income, but their actual effective rate on all income would be 4.1%. And in fact, we'd remain one of the lowest taxing states overall in the nation. It's just that there's so much concentration of wealth at the top that shifting tax burden there raises significant revenue, and in fact, more than the current system, while allowing you to cut taxes for most people, 94%. That would have the double advantage if you're cutting taxes for that 94% with flat or declining incomes over time of spurring economic activity. Because those folks can't afford to save because their incomes are flat or declining, so they'll continue to spend every nickel you give them, and they'll spend it in their local economy creating jobs. So if Illinois wants to solve problems, we go to a graduated rate structure. And we go to a graduated rate structure. No map, Amanda, I'm very horrified. We go to a graduated rate structure. We expand our sales tax base to services. We raise the revenue we need to make sustainable investment in core services. We better our economy, and we move forward. One last thing. People will say, if you raise taxes on affluent folks, you're going to ruin your state's economy, it'll fall apart, blah, 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 blah. Once again, none of that is supported by data. The Institute for Tax and Economic Policy compared economic growth of the 9 states in America that have no income tax versus the 9 states in America with the highest tax rates in an income tax. What they discovered was the high tax states over a long period, 2000 to 2012, had better growth in GDP per capita, better change in median wage, and identical unemployment rates. There's no basis to make this argument, at least if you use facts. So I appreciate you all listening. We have to fight for that graduated income tax to happen. I think there's a political chance that it could happen. Think about it, yes. That temporary tax increase that passed in January of 2011 that does start to go out in 2014, that's a problem. Yet the Speaker, the Senate President, and the Governor all promised that that would be temporary. What better thing to do than to replace that temporary tax and let it go away with a new graduated rate structure that cuts taxes for 94% of Illinois. And by the way, raises more revenue than the current system. They know they can't live with that loss in revenue that the temporary tax increase phase-out creates. Remember, we already have a hole of $7.7 billion. That's going to cause us to lose about $3.8 billion when it's fully phased in. We just can't do that. So net, 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 there's a political opportunity if we get on it now and we work for it for a couple of years.
What kind of support is there?
Interestingly enough, there's been a couple of amendments already put in, resolutions already put in to create a graduated rate structure constitutionally. And I think right now you won't see support for that kind of thing because it's an election year and it's new districts, etc. But I really think you'll start watching politicians listen much more closely to their constituents on this beginning in January of next year, which is why we need to start working on it now. These things take time. You hear no before you hear yes, but the opportunity certainly exists. I think a better opportunity than any other point in Illinois' history because of the loss of this temporary tax increase.
But isn't it fine in the case of what we are learning at the federal level of what is being proposed? What you outlined is precisely what a certain party in the country is proposing to do in terms of the taxes and policies.
Mm-hmm. The federal level is a little different than here. At the federal level, well, first of all, the Republican Party matters. That was meant as a joke, but in Illinois, the way they've drawn these maps, the Republicans are stuck in the minority forever, or at least for the next 10 years. And I do think that there's a number of Republicans in the state that get the fiscal problems that are moderate to good government. And so I think Illinois is a very different dynamic than what's happening at the federal level. No, we are different. We're different in a lot of ways.
You've made a very informative, eloquent presentation. Do legislators know this information, are aware of it?
Have they listened to you?
I could answer, so the question is, do legislators know and do they listen? And my answer to both questions is yes and no. Okay, so I'm being told by Linda time is over, so thank you very much.
You're watching the Illinois Channel, an independent nonprofit corporation formed to provide gavel-to-gavel coverage of Illinois state government and other public affairs events taking place across Illinois.